Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest tonight, Roger Root, who is the attorney for many of the defendants on January 6th. Doing a good job back there. Tell us all about it, Roger.
Well, it's funny. I'm glad you say I'm doing a good job.
I hope.
60 Minutes just did an expose, I guess, in their most recent 60-minute segment, and they said that there have been over 1,000 convictions of January 6ers, and just 2 individuals have been fully acquitted. And by the way, both of those have been fully acquitted by judge trials, in other words, bench trials, which they opted for. Obviously, everyone has a right to a jury trial. I much prefer jury trials myself. And the conviction rate for January 6ers in jury trials is 100% after 3.5 years. And I'll just say, having been an attorney in these cases, it is like trying a case in a hostile venue. It is absolute hostile terrain. Every single thing is stacked against us, including even the rules of evidence. The jury pool is 90, it depends on the election year, but in the 2020 election, if you believe the 2020 election returns, which I don't necessarily do, but let's just presume they're something close, 92% of District of Columbia residents, which are the jury pool in these trials, voted for Joe Biden. In other words, it is 92 or something. Some years it's 94% registered Democrat. Only 2% registered Republican in some years in DC. So just think of what we're up against. Obviously, January 6ers, generally speaking, are Trumpers, super MAGA Republicans. There, by the way, there are a handful of actual libertarians that have been that were in the mix there. And of course, I should say, although mainstream media denies this, there were an awful lot, at least 100 actual leftist type, either Antifa, Black Lives Matter, or there were at least 2 busloads. We have reports that there were busloads of Antifa, and I know mainstream media keeps saying this has been debunked. It has not. My team, I work with an attorney named John Pierce. I'm a partner with John Pierce, and we've tried. I myself have had 10 jury trials, January 6 trials, and I've also had 3, in addition, 3 bench trials. Some people opt for a bench trial because they know that the jury pool is so hostile. They've done polling in DC about this, where they ask people, what do you think of January 6ers? Could you be fair to them? And I don't have it off the top of my head. I could dig it up, but the polling is astounding. DC is different than any other venue in the United States. If these January 6 trials happened in Montana, or even in any other place, including a Democrat majority place, we would not see that conviction rate, because the DC residents believe, they are asked sometimes on surveys, and they believe that they were the victims, that they were attacked on January 6th by outsiders who came in and attacked them. So imagine a jury pool. I mean, hypothetically, just pretend that someone is on trial for rape, and the jury pool consists of rape victims. Okay, that's what we're talking about in these January 6 trials. It is literally the most hostile possible venue, and pretty much in every case, before a trial starts, we file a motion to change venue, along with almost every other lawyer in these cases. I believe over 100 motions to change venue have been filed. I myself have written, I don't know how many. They are all denied by the judges. And so, they all say, no, that the most proper venue is the place where the crime, allegedly was committed. And by the way, it has to be said that the 6th Amendment to the Constitution, if you read closely, the 6th Amendment says that all the trial of all crimes, or the accused has a right to a trial in the district, in the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed. All right, so the Constitution, the 6th Amendment, very much favors venue being where the crime allegedly occurred. And so it's an uphill battle to try to get those trials out of that jurisdiction. And thus far, all the federal judges have denied every single motion to change venue. And so it is just astounding. Here we are 3.5 years later. Not one judge has seen the light and recognized that nobody can get a fair trial. If you're a January 6er, you will not get a fair trial in DC. You cannot. The surveys are unbelievable. They ask people, do you believe that everyone who was there, even was present, is a criminal? Yes. The DC residents are different than the residents of any other place. And I believe, something like 48% responded to one survey. 48% of DC residents said that they believed that it should be life imprisonment for January 6ers if the evidence showed they were even there or it went inside the precious US Capitol building. Anyway, that's what we're dealing with. So I could go on and on. So it starts from there. So every single January 6th case really starts with that level of unfairness and imbalance. And then you add the hostility of the judges. Now I could go on and on. I don't, a lot of these judges are I would say very fair. We've had a few fair judges. They try to be professional, but remember, when you are biased, you don't recognize it. And of course, I myself, we all recognize we have had, all of us are biased and we don't even know it in some ways. And if you live in DC and are surrounded by that community, you are biased even if you don't know it. And so the application of the rules of evidence are overwhelmingly lopsided. And I could go on. If anyone wants to ask me a question, I'll answer any question, but I'll just say that every single January 6th criminal case begins. First, the government files a motion for a protection order. And it's always done with an absolute emergency status. And the judges always grant them 100%. They are always granted. And that means that all the evidence and the discovery is hidden from the public unless we get, permission. The only way we can get this stuff public generally is to attach it to a motion or to use it as an exhibit in trial. And once it is, a lot of this stuff is body cam footage by police. Some of it is surveillance footage from the building. There were a lot of surveillance cameras. And of course, then we also have hundreds of videos and photographs that were taken frequently by people who were present, including defendants. And each one of them when they are arrested, the FBI will seize their device and download all the videos and pictures of the events that day. And so there are just thousands of hours of footage. And every case begins with a protective order that we not release it to the public. And so these cases have this shroud of secrecy on them from the beginning. The venue is biased from the beginning. The FBI director, Christopher Wray, was testifying maybe a month ago before one of the committees of Congress. And Christopher Wray, the FBI director, said something to the effect of, he was reassuring these members of Congress who were saying, well, hey, we hear there were hundreds of FBI undercover informants in the crowd. Christopher Wray literally said something to the effect of, which is false. He said something like, oh no, the defense lawyers would have made a big deal out of that. The defense lawyers would have raised such a thing, and none of the defense lawyers have raised that. And of course, there have been hundreds who have pled guilty. By the way, there aren't many options if you're actually indicted. If you don't plead guilt, I'll jump to that later. But for the consequences of not pleading guilty quickly are very, very severe, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But Christopher Wray said, look how many people have pled guilty, and they don't assert that they were entrapped by undercover imposters or FBI agents of any kind. All right, let me just say that is a false statement by the FBI director, Christopher Wray. I think all of you are aware of the pipe bomb issue on January 6th. Almost anybody who followed January 6th very closely is aware that there were these reports of pipe bombs that were planted the night before, supposedly the night before January 6th, by some, it's never been solved, at the DNC and the RNC, the DNC, the Democratic National Committee office headquarter building, which is technically attached to the grounds of the Capitol. It's about a block or two away. And then there's the Republican National Committee building, also near the Capitol building. And there were these pipe bombs, and we all were aware of those. We were aware of those stories. Do you know that we have never gotten to the bottom of that? And I myself, as a lawyer, have asked every single question, every single time, at every trial that I have had, when the government puts a witness on the stand, the Secret Service or Capitol Police, I always ask, well, what about these pipe bombs? And I'm always shut down. The prosecutors always object. The judges always sustain the objection. So we never, ever get to the bottom of it. They don't provide anything in discovery. And I should say, I mentioned that the government files these motions for protective order. They also file lots of motions in limine, which are motions to preclude us from asking or discussing things. And the judges generally grant every single one of their motions all the time. So they preclude us from mentioning the First Amendment. We're not allowed to in front of the jury. Juries aren't allowed to hear about the First Amendment. Now, think about how ridiculous that is. By the way, I'm open to any question. Anybody can ask any question at any time. I'm trying to turn my phone ringer off here. Okay. So if you're not allowed to say that you were there for First Amendment purposes, what does that do to the trial? What does that do to the case? Think about it. It means that these judges are basically ruling in advance of the trial that the only possible reason for a person to be there essentially was unlawful. In other words, it was to attack Congress, to attack members of Congress, to disrupt the proceedings of that were going on in the Capitol, or to attack the building in some way. Because if you're not allowed to say, hey, I was there to try to influence, I was there to try to persuade, which would be a First Amendment protected thing. If you're not allowed to say to the jury, hey, I was there to try to persuade policymakers to do something or not to do something, which is, I think, if that were allowed as a defense, which it's not, that would preclude any claim of innocence, because at every one of these trials, the first witness is always a DC Capitol Police officer, usually a high-ranking one. Usually the first witness, and their chest, they'll be wearing uniforms covered with medals. All right. So the first witness in every one of these trials is a uniform wearing, high ranked Capitol Police officer, a lieutenant, sergeant, captain, whatever, with lots of medals, testifying as the voice of authority that the Capitol on January 6, 2021 was absolutely a restricted area. They had all these barriers, fences, cops were everywhere, warning signs were everywhere. And this is the testimony that goes to the jury. And by the way, every single one of these guys or girls is charged with entering and remaining in a restricted area. Okay. So let's just consider that idea. All of us are aware that, riots and political demonstrations and things frequently involve some level of civil disobedience, number one. So if you're at a riot or a protest, you're trying to get your voice heard, you're trying to persuade policymakers, frequently it is a thing to do that you join with others and you occupy a space. You do a sit down or a die in or a whatever. I mean, this is stuff that is age old in American history. It's been done millions of times. And so if you are there to do civil disobedience and to have your voice heard, the question then arises, well, is it really a restricted area? If the authorities are allowing you to be there, and by the way, I sometimes even argue in my opening statements about how, we've all seen championship basketball games and football games and soccer games where the crowd frequently at the end of the game will rush the field. Okay, have you guys all seen that? I know that you all have. Anybody who watches big, especially college football, college basketball, you will see that at the buzzer of the game, when your team wins, the crowd rushes the field. All right. So
Roger,
yeah.
Liam's got his hand up. Looks like he's got a question.
All right. Thank you. Let's hear the question.
Liam?
Yeah, so can you hear me all right?
I can hear you.
Yeah, so about the point you made that they're precluding the argument of the First Amendment right, are they pointing to an evidentiary rule? Like, how exactly are they saying you can't make that argument? Is it essentially they're making the case that if you get up there and say that this is a First Amendment right, that might sway the juror or the jury to believe that, like, is that essentially like the question that the jury is trying to answer and therefore it's precluded, or how do they base it?
Okay, they cite several rules of evidence. And by the way, they cite a concept that I believe is not actually settled in the law, which is this idea that sure, you have the right to speak, sure, you have the right to to protest, you have the right to petition government for redress of grievances. That's all right there in the First Amendment. But if you so much as violate the tiniest misdemeanor, if you commit any infraction, this is I'm telling you what the government argues. The government argues, sure, you've got a First Amendment right, but if you violate even the slightest rule, then your First Amendment rights go away. So if you commit the crime of trespassing, for example, then at that moment, the moment your toe crosses the line and you are trespassing, the government argues, hey, at that point, there is no First Amendment rights whatsoever. And of course, remember, they're asserting this before any evidence comes in. Even before the trial begins, they assert this. The judges generally grant this. They say that arguing the First Amendment would be irrelevant because, they violated, again, they were on restricted grounds. They have no First Amendment rights. If your toe crosses the line, according to the government, you cannot argue that you were there for a legitimate First Amendment purpose. You cannot argue you are innocent because of the First Amendment. Now, by the way, we are appealing that, and we will be appealing that to higher courts. We have a couple great cases. I'll go into that later, but that proposition of law is not settled. I write briefs on this all day long. I don't know how many briefs on this topic I've written, and I've done so much research on this. Believe it or not, okay, we are all Montanans, and we're aware of the great former Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin, one of the legends of Montana politics, Jeanette Rankin. During the 1970s, there was an organization called the Jeanette Rankin Brigade, which was a pacifist left-wing liberal group. Of course, by the way, I've researched Jeanette Rankin. She was never a liberal. She was a Republican, and she was in some ways a right-winger. Most people don't know that. Most Montanans don't know that. Jeanette Rankin was a right-winger, and probably she would be a MAGA Republican today. But that's for a different day. The Jeanette Rankin Brigade sued the Capitol Police in about the year 1971 or 72. And there is this great case that is on the books from that period in the 1970s. I think it's called Jeanette Rankin Brigade versus DC Commissioner, Police Chief, or something like that. It is a fantastic ruling where the courts, including both the DC District Court and the DC Circuit Court, and I believe there was a certiorari petition applied to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they denied it, which means it is binding case law in the D.C. courts. But it should be binding, but it's treated as they just ignore it. That case, the case called Jeanette Rankin Brigade versus Chief of Police of D.C. or whatever, said that the Capitol grounds are traditionally understood to be a free speech forum where the government cannot, except in extreme circumstances, limit your right to protest, to demonstrate, and to be heard. Now, just think about that. Here we have, in the January 6, 2021 context, thousands of people, over 1,500 right now, are being criminally prosecuted for going on to the grounds of the Capitol. Now, I'm going to also later get into the building, but just consider the grounds outside on the grass and on the sidewalks. Okay, so we have case law that has been on the books for 50 years saying that the grounds of the Capitol are a free speech forum, that the government cannot interfere with that except in the most extreme possible circumstances. All right, and these judges just ignore those cases. And the Jeanette Rankin Brigade case is just one of them. There's probably anywhere from 10 to 20 other cases that basically say the same thing from the 1970s, 1980s, when judges actually recognized First Amendment rights on the Capitol grounds. Remember, here's the point that I really want to make about where I will meld into my argument about sports fields when you jump onto the field at the end of the game. It is probably true that the first 10 people who do that probably recognize that they are doing something wrong. Okay, so if you storm the field, the word storm, the word storming the Capitol is always used in these cases. By the way, the word storming is not a legal word. There's no legal, it appears nowhere in the law, but the judges, they're imposing this idea that storming the Capitol is some kind of moral, outrageous crime. It's just an absolutely immoral act. But storming things is quite common. We storm football fields and baseball fields, etc. And like I said, the first 10 guys who jump on the field probably know they're doing something wrong, or at least doing something that the referees don't want, and that the police could probably stop them. Arguably, they might get an arrest for trespassing, arguably. By the way, even that is not clear to me, and it depends on the circumstances. Anyways, let me just try to wrap this point up. Okay, so the first 10 guys who rush the field probably know they're doing something wrong, or at least have the idea they might be able to be taken to the ground, arrested, or whatever. But what about the next 10 people? What about the next 100 people? And remember, in January 6th, there were thousands, probably, I'm guessing tens of thousands of people who, quote unquote, stormed the grounds of the Capitol. I'm not talking about the building right now. So being just out, and none of them, after the first 100 people, none of them saw any barricades, any police saying stay back, don't come in. There were no signs at that time. After the first 100, all the signs were down, the barricades were down, the bike racks were gone, the chain link fences, all of it was down. It was a festive atmosphere. Thousands of people were joyously, demonstrating on the Capitol grounds. And I should say not everyone was there for the same reason. Many of them, remember, there were different people. They all had different ideas. And another very important fact is that President Trump himself, who was the sitting president at that time, had only 45 minutes earlier, or an hour earlier, about a mile away, in an area of DC called the Ellipse area, which is near the White House. An hour earlier, the President of the United States said, "Hey, I'm going over there with you guys. I know you guys are going to join me. We will peacefully and patriotically protest over there." And so we're talking 100,000 people went over there, having been told that the President of the United States, who they supported, was also going over there with them, and they would meet the president over there, and it was going to be a joyous, festive time. And I've talked to many people, witnesses, who say it was actually a very, very happy and festive atmosphere, even though it was very cold that day. And then a variety of things happened around right after 1 o'clock. 1:20, 1:30, the police started to panic. There were police officers. Remember, I was in the Proud Boy trial. I was representing Dominic Pizzola. That was a 4.5-month trial. So that was pretty much the biggest trial in all of January 6 trials. And at that time was the biggest trial in the country in terms of news headlines. And Pizzola, of course, was the guy who famously grabbed a police officer's shield and used it to smash in some of the glass in the window and basically opened up the breach, allowing people to get in. And I could go into the details on that, but a lot of that happened because the police overreacted and panicked, and there were rubber bullets being fired. There were munitions being fired. And it is an absolute rule of police training that you never fire rubber bullets at people's heads or faces. And of course, what is the reason for those rules? Because they can kill people. When you hit someone in the eyeball or in the temple with a rubber bullet, it is a deadly weapon. It is deadly force. Okay. And they were firing at the crowd from up above, and the crowd was very packed together. And if you're a cop and you're firing rubber bullets from up above down into the crowd, which was the position that the police were firing from, you're going to hit people in the head, which is, again, a violation of their training. And it is it is considered deadly force. And what happens when deadly force is fired at you? Well, it triggers things legally in the law. At that point, you have the right to self-defense and defense of others. So if you're in a crowd and you see people next to you or even yourself being hit in the face or in the head with rubber bullets and flashbang grenades or whatever, you then have the right under the law, or you should. It hasn't been upheld very well, but you should have the right to self-defense. And frankly, the festive atmosphere, and this was probably about 1:45 or 2 o'clock or so in the afternoon on January 6, 2021, the festive atmosphere became an angry atmosphere, mostly because of the police and because people were being shot in the faces and in the heads illegally by the police, with rubber bullets, flashbang grenades, and what have you. My client, Dominic Pizzola, was outraged, like many others. He's a trained Marine. A lot of these guys are, there's a libertarian element to some of them, which I really do appreciate, but a lot of them also are what you call super patriot type, Republican, MAGA type. There's a some of them are libertarian, but a lot of them are more the traditional, let's call them, I hate to say it, I don't like to call people bootlickers, but there are a lot of bootlicker mentality. The lovers of military life, lovers of military, veterans and cops and all this. And so a lot of veterans were there that day. And I can't tell you how many clients that I've had who were former U.S. Marines. Dominic Pizzola was a former U.S. Marine. His training is, his military instincts kicked in like others, and basically they went into almost combat mode. And Dominic Pizzola was, along with others in the crowd, ended up wrestling and grabbing and things, and a couple cops were taken to the ground. My client, Mr. Pizzola, came up with one of the plastic riot shields. Others did also. And so at that point, there was a lot of pushing and shoving, and the festive atmosphere became angry. And around, I guess, 2:15-ish, that day was when the first breach of the actual building happened. Pizzola was not the first person, by the way, to strike at a window. The first window was broken by, and here we get to the mystery, the Fedsurrection questions. Almost nobody knows this, but the first window at the Capitol that was broken was on the east side. The Capitol, by the way, for those who haven't seen it, is one of the largest public buildings in America. It's a huge building. Most of the violence on January 6th was on the west side, but there was also a lot of action on the east side. The very first window that was broken was on the east side, and it was broken by a man named Hunter Emke. And it's not 100% clear, but we believe he was an Antifa activist. I have a friend who's a reporter named Bobby Powell who interviewed his mother. That Hunter Emke was a very young man. He might have been 19, 20, 21 years old. Almost had no it was not a Trumper of any kind. I mean, and if you look at the videos of the kid, he looked like Antifa. He looked like a lefty, and I don't know, I'm stereotyping, but his mother said he was an anarchist or an Antifa leaning individual. And I don't think he's ever been really interviewed, but he was the first person to break a window, and he ended up getting, I think, 6 months in jail. Okay. First guy to break a window, Hunter Emke, and you can look his name up. He was not a MAGA Republican. We believe he came there with the Antifa group, and he was the first guy to break a window. The first guy to break a window on the west side is an unidentified man that the government says they cannot identify, even though he is seen on many videos in full face exposed, talking even to police. And he was the first guy to break a window on the west side. My client Pizzola actually took the plastic shield that he had grabbed down below, and he used it to clean out some of the glass. By the way, it's funny. I during that trial, I was cross-examining one of the government witnesses, and I said, "Isn't it true that he was adding value to the building?" He was charged. Remember, he was one of the charges was damaging federal property over $1,000. First of all, it wasn't over $1,000. Those windows, anyone would have. We had an expert witness who was ready to go, who the judge blocked from taking the stand. We had an expert witness on windows who would have testified that those windows, if anything, were $200 windows, $300 windows. They were not $1,000 windows. So, just on the basis of that dollar amount, Pizzola was wrongly convicted. Anyways, and I pointed out that after the unnamed individual broke the window and cracked the window, Pizzola took the shield and cleaned out the glass, and arguably he added value, because once a window is cracked, it has to be removed. And you could argue that if you're hiring a window repairman, it takes time, and it takes obviously. So the repairman is then adding value to the building by cleaning out the broken glass. All right. Now, I got some laughs. Even the jury laughed at that. But anyway, the point is that the first guy to break the window was a guy wearing a red hat, unidentified to this day. By the way, the hat had a tag on it that made it apparently a brand new MAGA, Make America Great Again baseball cap, brand new. All right. So very mysterious character. We still to this day don't know who he was. And again, there are all these other mystery players that have not been identified. There was a mystery guy who climbed some scaffolding with a megaphone and was telling people, "Come forward, go forward, go forward." Never identified. Almost the leader of the push to go toward the building. Never identified. We all know about the case of Ray Epps. Ray Epps was a guy who seemed to be telling everybody to go into the Capitol probably a dozen times. Into the Capitol. He got away finally after such the American people who were following it were so outraged that he was not charged. They finally charged him with a fairly petty misdemeanor, and he got out with no jail time at all. Ray Epps. I didn't really finish the point I was going to make about the pipe bombs. Every time we asked a witness any question about the pipe bombs, the government objects, the judge sustains the objection on the grounds that it's irrelevant. So what the government does in these trials is they put on the big picture, and then they cabin us, the defendant, to speaking only of the small picture. So they force the defendant to being able to put on evidence only of what he saw with his own eyes, while the government, in prosecuting him, will put on evidence of the big picture. In other words, how the terrors of January 6th, how scared the police were all over the building. And they'll even get away in some cases. We object very strenuously. And by the way, this is going to be appealed in several appeals. The government puts on these video montages of violence that our defendant never saw. I'm not kidding. This is how unfair these trials are. So our client almost never saw any of this violence. Might have seen, depends on the circumstances. But the government gets to put on videos and show the jury all the violence around the building. And they are allowed to do this to show that there was this big event in the Capitol, which was, by the way, just an absolute ceremonial event, counting these ballots. Everybody already knew the outcome. There was not a chance in hell that the outcome of January 6th was going to change by anything that happened with these protesters or demonstrators. So this ceremonial vote counting thing is used as this fake grounds to justify these extreme sentences and extreme prosecutions, with this idea that they were somehow undermining democracy, attacking democracy, interfering with the peaceful transfer of power of the presidency. All of it, we've heard this, I don't know how many hundreds of times, and it's all a lie. It is a ceremony. In fact, some of you might know that the vice president, Mike Pence, at that time, Mike Pence was under a lot of pressure from Trump and the Trump team to, remember the vice president sits as the president of the U.S. Senate. He breaks ties. So on very big significant days, the vice president becomes the chair of the U.S. Senate, the president, you could say, of the U.S. Senate. So it is the vice president, Mike Pence, who was actually with the gavel in his hand, acting as the chairman of the U.S. Senate and sort of the master of ceremonies. There was a lot of pressure on him to allow for proceedings such as analysis of the objections of some states, such as Arizona and other states that were objecting. Anyway, Mike Pence, very cowardly in my opinion, because I do believe the election had lots of problems. I do believe that 2020 election, and remember, I'm a card-carrying libertarian. I've never voted for Trump. I voted for Joe Jorgensen, but I will say that it's pretty obvious to me that the election was stolen from Trump. By the way, I would love to debate anyone on that. I could tell you my grounds for believing that, but I'm one of millions. Polls show that I am one of millions. I believe Trump actually won that election, even though I did not vote for Trump, never supported Trump. I'm a card-carrying libertarian. But anyway, Mike Pence, in my opinion, was very cowardly, and instead of doing what I think he should have done, which is to open up the floor to some proceedings and some considerations of these objections, he cowardly wrote a letter saying, well, this is nothing but a ceremony. This is not a time to do any analysis of ballots of any kind, nothing but a ceremony. And my role, Mike Pence said, his role was to do nothing but stand there as mostly a master of ceremonies and allow these votes and ballots to be just counted as everyone assumed they would be. And in fact, it was almost inevitable. I don't know what could have, to this day, I don't know what could have been in anyone's minds if no one could have thought they were going to be able to do anything to change the outcome that day. But anyway, where was I going? Okay, the government is using January 6th to crush the First Amendment, the most fundamental freedoms and rights that Americans have to protest and to criticize government are being totally destroyed in the context of these January 6th prosecutions. I see a question from Gloria. Let me just finish my thought. Some of you may not know this, but the sentences for January 6ers are the highest and most harshest and most severe sentences in U.S. history for engaging in any political rioting or protesting. A lot of people don't know that. But when I went to law school, we were taught of these outrageous injustices of American history and how petty political dissidents were prosecuted and over prosecuted. Some of you have heard of the case of Eugene v. Debs. I know I'm sure Eugene v. Debs, back during World War I, was a socialist, and he ran for president, and he also gave some speeches against World War I. So he gave some speeches against World War I, and he was prosecuted by the federal government for a crime, seditious conspiracy to undermine the morale of the U.S. troops or something like that, and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. I believe President Calvin Coolidge later pardoned him while he was in prison. But here's the point. When I was in law school, we were taught that was one of the most outrageous injustices of all time, Eugene v. Debs' 10-year prison sentence. And, we've all heard about other horrible, outrageous injustices. I'm thinking of the Chicago Seven, who created a riot at the Chicago Democratic National Convention in 1968. The Chicago Seven were put on trial for, similar ideas, creating, destroying democracy, whatever, and all these overarching, unbelievable exaggeration charges. And I think the highest sentence for the Chicago Seven was 5 years in prison. Let me say that in the January 6th context, 5 years is nothing. They are giving out 20 and 18, 22-year. Enrique Tarrio was given a 22-year prison sentence, and he wasn't even there. He literally, on the day of January 6th, was watching the events from a motel room in Baltimore. He was given 22 years in prison for being this mastermind of the Proud Boys. And I was with him in that trial every single day for 4.5 months. Completely innocent. He didn't do anything. Basically, the crime of seditious conspiracy was nothing but a bunch of memes. I mean, these Proud Boys were sharing with each other lots of violent memes, and they were joking about things, and they were on the Telegram, and all the other one was starts with a P, Parler. Some of you might remember Parler. They were all banned from Facebook, and Twitter at the time. So they were on Parler and Telegram, and they were sharing memes back and forth. And on the basis of the memes, they were convicted of seditious conspiracy. Tario is doing 22 years, 18-year sentences. There's another Proud Boy named Christopher Worrell who's doing 10 years in federal prison right now for the crime of holding up a little tiny bottle of pepper spray that you can buy over the counter at 7-Eleven, including in DC, by the way. You can buy pepper spray over the counter at 7-Eleven, sprayed it in the direction of a cop. He's doing 10 years in federal prison. Again, these sentences are so outrageously extreme, they make all the other injustices of American history look like nothing. This is we all know American history is filled with injustices and horrible treatments of dissidents, but nothing compares to what is happening right now. The most extreme violations of the First Amendment and the right to dissent, the right to criticize government, are happening right now in these January 6 cases. Let me quickly move to the question by Gloria. She says, have any appeals already been filed? If so, are they moving forward or getting summarily dismissed? I'm glad you asked that question because I am an appeal guy. I love appeals. Remember that you only make the law. Liam could probably talk about this. The law is made on appeal. It's not made at trial. Nothing that happens at trial establishes any precedent other than perhaps a fleeting precedent that might also, another judge down the hallway might also listen to. But the law is made on appeal, and we have got, I've had 13 trials, 10 jury trials in the January 6th context, and I'm hoping to have an appeal on a different issue in each one of those. There have been, of course, we're not the only legal team. The Public Defender's Office have appealed some great things, including this idea that the Capitol grounds were a restricted area on January 6th. The Public Defender's Office down there is appealing that because in DC, there's a protest at the Capitol grounds almost every single day. I mean, think of how ridiculous this is. Every day, and by the way, the Capitol Police, when you cross-examine them, they will admit that this is quite common. Almost every single day at the U.S. Capitol, there is some kind of disruptive protest of some kind, almost every day. But for some reason, January 6ers are treated like, this was an attack. This was not a protest. It was an absolute violent attack. Again, there's a fine line. But in the big picture, if you are storming something to protest, if you're trying to have your voice heard, you're trying to persuade policymakers to do something or not do something, there's a fine line. And I think most Americans would recognize that until you beat up a congressman, and if you're just waving and angrily yelling at the congressman, that is a First Amendment protected thing. You're trying to have you're trying to influence and persuade the congressman. By the way, even showing anger to a policymaker is an attempt at persuasion. So they are trying to establish an idea that you cannot even express, violent anger at government. This is horrible what they are trying to accomplish. And if they ultimately are able to do it, this country is gone in terms of the traditional value we have had for the Bill of Rights. I'm writing briefs every single day, appeal briefs. I am actually going to be arguing the largest Fourth Amendment, the single largest warrant in American history happened in the January 6th context, and that is the government filed these warrants to search the phone locations, the cell locations of every single cell phone in the Capitol or on the Capitol grounds on January 6th. And I argue that this is the largest search warrant in American history, and it is a general warrant. Some of you might know the difference between a legal warrant, which the Fourth Amendment says that warrants shall issue only upon probable cause, specifically based on the person, the time, the place, the thing to be searched. There must be probable cause with individual specificity. All right. But in the context of January 6th, they issued these general warrants to Google and to AT&T and MCI and these cell phone providers to give them the location of every cell phone without any specific probable cause with regard to each individual, which I argue was actually required. So I am actually going to be arguing the case of the largest search warrant in American history, and that's coming up. That's filed in the case of Lloyd Cruz. That'll be going to the DC Circuit. We filed the first brief. We're waiting on the government's brief. I take it back. Government's brief is already in. We're going to be replying to that. Okay, we have other cases. By the way, some of the most fundamental things about federal law involve the crime of assaulting officers. We have guys, listen to this. Some of these guys get charged with assaulting officers, quote unquote, for doing things like throwing a shoulder at a police shield or having an elbow up at a police shield, and they are charged with assaulting federal officers. A very serious crime. Up to 8 years in federal prison if convicted. And we had a guy named Kenneth Joseph Thomas. We have that on appeal. We are arguing that, throwing a shoulder up, pressing against a shield in a riot situation, that is not assaulting a federal officer. We have cases where the cops get on the stand, the so-called victims of the quote-unquote assaults, they take the stand and they admit, I don't even remember it. I don't remember being assaulted by this guy. So here's the cop on the stand. The client is charged with assaulting this cop. The cop takes the stand and admits, I don't really remember this guy. So here they are on January 6th. These cops all had shields and riot gear, and they were being pushed and shoved. There was a lot of pushing and shoving. And remember, we all recognize there were people acting up, people acting probably improperly. All right. Everyone acknowledges that. And we have cases of clients convicted, January 6th defendants convicted of assaulting officers, where the officers, the so-called victims, don't even remember being assaulted. I'm not even making this up. This is how over-prosecuted these cases are. We have, by the way, we're going to be challenging some of the jury instructions on appeal. Some of you may know that I've been a legal advisor to a group called the Fully Informed Jury Association in the past. The Fully Informed Jury Association argues that jurors should really be fully informed that they have the right to say not guilty, even in a case where the government proves cases beyond a reasonable doubt. So let me just sum this up. I'll give a quick lecture on this topic. This is almost another topic, a great topic if you want to study the law, which is, I think everyone recognizes if you're a juror and the government fails to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, I think we all recognize what the juror is required by the law to do, and that is to acquit. We all recognize that. If the government fails to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, every juror in the world is required to say not guilty. We all recognize that. Okay, what if the government proves its case beyond a reasonable doubt? Are you a juror? Are you required to convict? All right. The government argues that you must convict if the government proves its case beyond a reasonable doubt, that you are required under the law. If the government proves its case beyond a reasonable doubt, if you're a juror, the government and most of the judges, by the way, hold that you are required as a juror to find the defendant to find the defendant guilty, and it's just not true. And I've studied this issue going back hundreds of years. The founding fathers recognized this, every single one of them, that there is an absolute right to acquit, even if the defendant takes this witness stand and admits and confesses to the crime under oath in open court. You still have the right under the Constitution to acquit him and find him not guilty. And we are going to be challenging the must convict jury instruction in one of these cases coming up. I see Carson has his hand raised.
Yeah, Roger, thanks very much for talking to us today. I'd like you to address two different issues. One is the resources and the funding for the January 6th defendants, and where that's coming from, and their positions as far as resources, especially relative to the government, which I always understand is very disproportionate, but it seems more extreme than normal in this case. Secondly, I'd like you to address the police officer deaths during and after January 6th, how that's perceived by the public, the prosecution, and the defendants.
Okay, great, excellent questions. With regard to the funding, I can tell you that most of these guys are flat broke. They have no money. I've been working with an attorney named John Pierce, and he's John Pierce Law, and he has established a nonprofit called the NCLU, the National Constitutional Law Union, which he's trying to establish as sort of an answer to the ACLU. There are some donation groups that have tried to raise money and help with legal funds. I can just tell you that it's you already mentioned, Carson, that it's overwhelming. It's so lopsided. The government has so many resources. Of course, under the Constitution, under the Gideon v. Wainwright rule, everyone charged with a felony has a right to an attorney for free, of course. But what happens is they get a court-appointed lawyer or the public defender, and it is inevitable. And by the way, I'll give those guys some props. They're not all bad. So a lot of them are great lawyers. But court-appointed lawyers tend to, they're not paid much, and they tend to tell them to plead guilty. It's just very, very common. And remember, these public defenders overwhelmingly are liberal Democrats, and which is just fine. They don't actually like January 6ers as a general rule, and so they don't tend to be very ideologically supportive. And so, by and large, our firm always gets we get these January 6ers who have been told to plead guilty, sometimes by two different lawyers, and they fired the first one, and then the second one tells them to plead guilty, and then they come to us, and by then they're flat broke. And again, their efforts to fundraise, it's not always. We end up taking. We had a case of a guy named John George Todd. We took all the way to trial. The guy couldn't pay a penny. He might have paid, I forget, $200 out of it. I mean, literally, like we're talking $50,000 worth of legal defense for $500. I mean, we end up doing that, but it's part of we are. I guess I'm a libertarian crusader. I think most people recognize. On the other hand, we had another client, Rebecca Lavrenz, known as the praying grandmother, who, because she was so the public just adores her. She's in her 70s. She went inside the Capitol for just a few minutes. She said she went in to pray for America, and she was convicted of 4 misdemeanors. The public has raised, in terms of donations, I think $80,000 to $100,000. I mean, she has managed to because the public just is so sympathetic to her case. She is the only one that we have that has fully been able to pay her bills. And by the way, the government swoops in at sentencing and tries to seize every single penny that these people raise for their defense. This is so sick. This is so evil. But the judge in Rebecca Lavrenz's case gave her a $103,000 fine, at the urging of the government, by the way, the prosecution, on the grounds that she's profiting from crime, quote unquote. This is the argument, profiting from crime. So just because she's so sympathetic and the American public is so outraged at her prosecution that people have sent in $500, $1,000 checks, to support her, and the government got the judge to issue a $103,000 fine, which we believe is the largest fine in American history for a misdemeanor. We're still researching that. We believe that Rebecca Lavrenz's $103,000 fine is the largest fine in history for a misdemeanor, and we will obviously be appealing that fine, among other things. So in terms of the finances, listen, if anybody can donate, I know we're all tapped out. We're all libertarian activists. We donate to libertarian causes, but nclu.com is the website. People sometimes, can contribute 20 bucks, 50 bucks, whatever. I'll just say as a lawyer, I've never been able to I'm a crusader, so I would work for nothing. And so, most people recognize that. I can't make phone calls and ask for money. I just can't. I've never been a successful lawyer for that reason. But I've now partnered with John Pierce Law, and he, I have a little bit of infrastructure now. And let's just say that I'm doing fine myself. I have no real complaints. But anyway, the funding for these cases is a problem, and it's going to be even more so. A lot of people are just waiting for Trump to get elected and pardon everybody. So it's very difficult to raise legal defense funds now for these guys. The second part of your question was about the police officer deaths. Okay, so this has been a source of mythology. The government has promoted this notion, which is false, that there were police officer deaths on January 6th. It's not true. Not one cop passed away from January 6th. There were 5 protesters who died. And by the way, the government has also manipulated that. I think most of us know the case of Ashley Babbitt, who was shot illegally, literally shot for just trying to go through a window in the United States of America, unarmed. The law requires that you can only use deadly force if there is the threat of deadly force against you or others. And a cop just shot her in the throat or in the chest for trying to go through a window in the United States of America, unarmed. And the cop has not even been threatened with prosecution. And as far as I know, he's still on the job. It is a national disgrace. So she was murdered in the U.S. Capitol. Ashley Babbitt was. By the way, she was a registered libertarian in the state of California. There was also someone who died in the tunnel on the west side. Her name was Roseanne Boyland, another protester. She was, if you look at the videos, an overweight young woman. The government has smeared her. She died in the tunnel and was trampled by 1,000 people walking on top of her. The government has smeared her, saying she died of a drug overdose. We believe that's completely false. I believe they are going to sue or are suing over that death, but she basically was exposed to in an enclosed space, lots of CS gas and tear gas in a very enclosed space. She died. She suffocated and had a heart attack due to unlawful police releases of those gases and brutality. There was cops also punching and clubbing her while she was on the ground, and she was murdered. A lot of people don't know there were 2 murdered protesters that day. There were also 3 other gentlemen who died while protesting. They had heart attacks and things, and we believe at least 2 of those involved flashbang grenades nearby. So the government murdered people on January 6th. No one from the government was murdered on January 6th. There was a police officer named, what's the name? Sicknick, Officer Ryan Sicknick, who died of natural causes, I believe 2 days later in a hospital. And as far as I know from what I've researched, it had no relation to January 6th. He died of natural causes 2 days later in a hospital bed. Again, I stand to be corrected if I'm wrong, but I believe they've looked, everyone who, with a reason to look, has tried to link his death to January 6th. It didn't happen. And then there were, I think, a few other officers, maybe 4, who are said to have committed suicide in the days or weeks after January 6th. I'll just say, by the way, I should, listen, no one should ever die on the job. No one should ever have to die for going to work. I don't know enough about those officer suicides to talk about it. Ironically, we've been questioned enough about this that our paralegal is looking at those body cams of those officers to see if their January 6th body cam video is really so horrendous that they suffered trauma or something and that led them to commit suicide. I don't know. I won't say anything bad about those officers. God bless each and every one of them. I don't know enough. But I can tell you this: in the wake of January 6th, there have been many January 6th defendants who have committed suicide. More than the police. Many of them have committed suicide after being charged with outrageous 1512 US Code, 18 US Code Section 1512 C2 charges, which is a 20-year felony. Charged with a 20-year felony for just protesting in the United States of America, where they were, they go there, and frequently they're charged when they refuse to plead guilty to a misdemeanor. This is an outrageous conduct by the prosecution, where after a year or so where they fought and said, I'm not pleading to a misdemeanor, the government then issues a superseding indictment against these defendants, charging them with felonies, and in some cases, extremely serious felonies, a 20-year felony for obstructing an official proceeding. There have been a couple that committed suicide after that. And by the way, there are a couple others we suspect of having committed suicide. They died in motorcycle wrecks and car wrecks and things I believe were actual suicides. I don't know. But anyway, there have been far more January 6ers who died and committed suicide in the wake of that. So let me read some more of these questions here. Okay, Gloria follows up the issue of funds for the defendants. Has the Institute of Justice or FIRE, that's the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, or any other such First Amendment groups gotten involved? That's a good question, and the answer is I don't know. Now, I love the Institute for Justice, great libertarian organization. FIRE is also. FIRE mostly fights for academic free speech. So I don't know the answer if they've gotten involved in fundraising for January 6ers. So I don't know the answer to that. I should say, now I just mentioned that 1512 statute, obstruction of an official proceeding. Some of you know that the US Supreme Court, in a case called Fisher versus United States, about 2 months ago, the US Supreme Court swooped in with a very courageous ruling. I'm very glad they did, saying that statute was written by Congress never with the intention that it would apply to mere protesting, that it's actually a statute that is related to obstruction of justice by evidence tampering or by bribery, or obstructing an official proceeding by witness tampering or something along those lines. It is the Supreme Court held in that Fisher decision. It is not supposed to be imposed on people who protested or quote unquote stormed the US Capitol. And so I think over half of those January 6, 1512 prosecutions have now been dismissed. I should say we have a couple cases where the government continues to refuse to drop those 1512 charges. And now in the wake of the Fisher case, they are claiming falsely, in my opinion, that those prosecutions do relate to evidence tampering somehow. I have a case on appeal. A guy named Hatchet Speed. Hatchet Speed was convicted of the 1512 charge, obstruction of an official proceeding, given a 4-year federal prison sentence. And the government still will not drop him and release him from prison. Even right now, they're still trying to cling to that 1512 conviction, even though the Supreme Court has said it doesn't apply to protesting. Perry Bartol asked the question, how did you get involved in this topic? Did you have a relationship with a dependent, or did you proactively produce yourself as a counsel interested in making the effort to help? Is there some personal reason why this is something I'm passionate about? It's an interesting question. It's so strange. If you want to know how I got into it, I had been in the Bundy case, working in the Bundy cases in Oregon and Nevada. And one day, a couple of years ago, I get a call from Jeanette Finicum. And of course, her husband was murdered by the Oregon State Police in a snowbank in Oregon. An FBI hostage rescue team also fired shots and then lied and tried to cover that up. So her husband was killed, and I had been in a lawsuit, which was ultimately dismissed, unfortunately. And Jeanette Finicum called me up and asked me if I wanted to take over her wrongful death. I take that back. She wanted me to just brief the lawyers. She said she had other lawyers that were taking over the wrongful death lawsuit regarding her husband. And would I brief them on the case, because I was one of the lawyers with the most knowledge about the subject? So I said, sure, have him call me. So I was in a couple conference calls with John Pierce, the lawyer that I am now partnered with, and other lawyers from his firm, because I was sort of an expert on the Bundy case and the Lavoy Finicum killing. And so I briefed them, and a couple conference calls later, they asked me to join their firm. So I joined their firm, and one thing led to another. They had a bunch of January 6 cases, and I ended up getting involved in the January 6 cases that way. I see you've got your hand up, Perry.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a great answer. Thank you. And for those of us who might want to contribute to the efforts you're making, is there a 501c3 that we can donate to? I know that many of the defendants themselves have launched fundraising efforts, but your particular efforts, is there an organization that backs you, so to speak?
Well, I mentioned the NCLU. Now, I believe we that there are fundraising sites for each defendant. Most of these January 6 cases I'm working on through that website, nclu.com. I must say that as a lawyer, I'm the absolute worst money raiser in the world. I just don't care enough, and I can't stand making phone calls begging for money. I can't stand it. And that's why I was never successful as a lawyer. I just couldn't do it. And so I'm actually glad I've joined with, a team that where they're trying to, at least send the invoices out. I literally could never even bill a client. And so I just don't care enough. So that the answer is I never deal with these questions. If you want to, by the way, we love support. We need support. nclu.com. And that's John Pierce's organization. He's my legal partner.
Great. Thank you for taking the time to come speak to us. And it's been really inspiring to hear you showcase your commitment to such important ideals, because I think within the law, within the application of the law, ideals and principles matter. And so thank you for your commitment to those.
All right. Well, thank you. I don't know. Dave, how long is this show normally?
As long as you want. There's
Okay.
no time limit. So I kind of go till people quit running and run out of things to say, and people quit, like Liam, quit having any questions.
Okay. Okay. Well, I've got Clayton. Clayton asks of all the people that were present on January 6th and have been charged, do you know if there are many that were charged with basic trespassing or other things that would be appropriate for their actions, that is, of the people who left the permitted area? Let me just say, I mentioned that protesting in DC is as common as dirt. It happens every single day. In fact, I've cross-examined Capitol police officers who admit that every day at the U.S. Capitol, there is a protest of some kind or another, or a demonstration of some kind or another. Some have permits, some do not. Some have, big installations and signs and things that are erected. Some do not. There are protests of all kinds. And there are angry protests where they shout at members of Congress as they are leaving or coming. And there are festive protests. There are all kinds of demonstrations. The vast majority of angry riots and things that have happened at the U.S. Capitol resulted in participants getting things like a $50 fine. Some of you may remember when Brett Kavanaugh was being sworn in as a U.S. Supreme Court justice during the Trump years. That would have been about, I think, the year 2018, I believe. There were protesters who shut down the Capitol and did every single thing that J6ers are accused of. There were protesters who occupied the Rayburn office building and some of the congressional office buildings, took over and did sit downs and things like that. Civil disobedience where they refused to move and had to be carried out by cops. By the way, in my opinion, that's all great stuff. That's part of America. Americans are protesters, and it's all, whether you're left wing or right wing, I'm all for it. That's my take on it. But these January 6ers should be treated like the ones in the past, who got the $50 fines. And so no, but the answer is no. They're all being prosecuted, even the ones who did nothing but walk or stand in the wrong place, supposedly. They're all being prosecuted with most of them get what we call the 4 standard misdemeanors. Count 1 is entering and remaining in a restricted area. Count 2 is always disorderly conduct in a restricted area. Then there's another one that's from a different section of the U.S. Code called disorderly conduct in the Capitol. And then the count 4 generally is a charge called picketing and parading inside the Capitol. So the answer is no, they're not treated like protesters of the past. DC had riots in the 1970s during the Vietnam War, where rioters shut down the city of DC, called the May Day riots, all through the years, I believe 1969 through 1970. Riots shut down the city of DC. They blocked deliberately. I mean, you know, some of you we've all heard of the Watergate Hotel, where the Watergate break-in happened in 1970. I don't even know, 72 or something. We're all aware of the Watergate Hotel. The Watergate Hotel also is where a lot of members of Congress stay, and they stay in the Georgetown area and the nicer areas of DC. The May Day riots deliberately shut down sections and targeted the Watergate Hotel. They blocked bridges of DC. They had a manual in which they stated their intention was to stop the federal government and basically block the federal government from being able to function, and to stop Congress from being able to function. This was written in their manual, that their goal was to stop Congress from functioning, and they did. All right. And remember, these January 6ers are charged with that same idea for stopping Congress from functioning for 6 hours, just 6 hours. And you know, they're looking at, you know, decades in prison, years in prison for blocking, for causing a 6-hour delay in Congress. And yet back during the May Day riots of the 1969 and 70, people were blocking Congress all the time, shutting down the federal government. And if you go back farther in time, there was something called the Bonus Army March in DC, where during the Great Depression, there were so many poor people who were veterans of World War I who took over the Capitol grounds and just camped. I mean, they overwhelmed the forces of the federal government and took over the Capitol and the Capitol office buildings, literally camped there illegally for months, at least weeks, took over these buildings for weeks. The Bonus Army, look up the Bonus Army back in about 1929 or 30. And they had to be ultimately they were removed by the U.S. Army, including future General Patton, and General MacArthur in their youth had to take to horseback. And the U.S. Army actually had to finally ride through the Capitol grounds with weapons to remove all the protesters that were camped out and dug in there. So there's been a history of rioting at the Capitol, and it's never been punished with these years in federal prison, like what's happening in the January 6th context. So, any other questions? I could go on and on. I could go on until I totally lose my voice.
Yeah, Roger, I have one more question. So recently Tucker Carlson interviewed Dave Smith, and in his interview, he was talking about Ray Epps and the other people that supposedly instigated the events on J6, and he alluded to Nick Fuentes. Do you know anything about Nick Fuentes's role? I think Tucker was trying to suggest some things about who was backing him, but I'm just curious about that because I hadn't heard that before Tucker's interview.
Okay, that's a good question. I don't know much about this. I do know Nick Fuentes. There were several others in the wake of January 6th. I think he was put on a no-fly list. And I think the Alex Jones group, they had they were almost every, patriot institution in America, the Oath Keepers, etc. They all had, some of them were spending big bucks to have permitted events. A lot of people don't realize the Oath Keepers actually were performing security for some of these events, including escorting speakers such as Roger Stone back and forth to the podiums and the stages. I mean, they were hired by members of Congress to provide security on January 6th. And this is another, I could go on and on. The Oath Keepers ended up foolishly going inside the Capitol thinking that they were helping and that they were going to protect, and they did actually protect law enforcement inside the Capitol, but it didn't help at all, because in the end they took a fall because the government faked these prosecutions and said they were there to seditiously commit conspiracy to overthrow this ballot certification thing, which again, there is no peaceful transfer of power under the law that happens on January 6th. It is nothing but a ceremonial ballot count, nothing more. The transfer of power, of course, in the presidency happens on January 20th of the election years, or the years following the election. The 20th is the peaceful transfer of power. So nothing happens on January 6th. This is such a scam that these guys are all accused falsely of, disrupting democracy or whatever. It's an absolute farce, a fraud, and a hoax. It's an absolute joke, and this thing is an absolute black spot on the history of civil liberties in the United States. So to the question about Nick Fuentes, I follow him a little bit. I don't know. I've heard him speak. Some people say he's radical racist and whatnot. I actually haven't even seen him say anything like that. I've seen him. He seems, I don't know. I mean, from what I've seen, he's he has his insights. I don't know. The answer is I don't know about Nick Fuentes. I do know Ali Alexander also. He had events there. Alex Jones, of course, was a speaker. They all had speaking events, and they were actually going to be setting up staging on the east side of the Capitol, which none of it ever happened because the whole thing became such a, pardon my friends, a shit show. And in the end, all that, there were going to be all kinds of speeches and things on the east side of the Capitol and elsewhere around the Capitol. And by the way, the thousands of protesters that went there thought they were going to permitted events. There were actual little pamphlets and flyers saying, come to this speech, come to that speech. After Trump's speech over at the Ellipse, which is about a mile away, they all thought they were walking to events that were permitted, and they end up being prosecuted. I mean, this is outrageous.
It looks like Clayton has some questions in the comments as well.
He says, so it is safe to say that the feds are using this as an example to show that they're going to get what they want. I will say there is an obvious effort. And again, it's stemming generally from the American left or the Democratic Party. It's funny. I just read Naomi Wolf's book the other day, her book called, I have it around me. Anyway, A Letter to a Young Patriot or something like that. The End of America. Great book, by the way. Some of you know who Naomi Wolf is. She was a leftist Democrat for years and was even an advisor, a political advisor to Democrat presidential candidates like Al Gore. She was one of his big advisors. Now she's on the team of the MAGA forces. She's gone full circle. Naomi Wolf said that she perceived an effort of the right wing in America, the Republican establishment, to establish a one-party government forever, and basically a uniparty using the Republican Party as the base. And that was all through the George W. Bush years, that what they were going to try to do is create, after the George W. Bush years, a system where all the elections would be rigged. They'd all be about 48 to 50% vote, and the Republican would always eke out the win each time, and that ultimately the Republicans would control the two branches of Congress and would have a one-party government controlling the United States. And it's so amazing that she wrote that, because what we're seeing, I guess here's where I'm tying into the question. What we're seeing now, and it's a decade later, is it's the Democratic Party and the left-wing forces of America that are, in my mind, appearing to do this. So they're using the billionaire class, the World Economic Forum, and the CIA, the deep state, the world of intelligence, to rig things for their favor so that they will have one party rule. And they view Trump, I guess, as anathema to this, or some kind of extreme source of potential problems for them. So because he's not, I guess, an establishment Republican or something. Anyways, again, I've never supported Trump, never voted for Trump, but it is quite obvious that they are absolutely rigging the federal government. And they are, if you look at what the Democrats, all the Democratic leaders are now on record, especially in the last month, saying that censorship is one of their big policy agendas going forward. They're all saying that, oh yeah, sure, there's conceptually, there's this thing called the First Amendment. Sure, there's freedom of speech, but it doesn't protect misinformation, doesn't protect hate speech. Of course, these are all concepts that are new and defined by the government. And by the way, we all recognize that misinformation is what they do, and it's what the government does. The COVID, they created so much misinformation about the COVID source, about all of those things. That was pure misinformation. And Russiagate, all pure misinformation. And yet government, they're all on record now pushing this idea that government should and even must control and patrol and police the speech of all major news platforms. And so they all align with the government's agenda. And I think this is all in line in terms of prosecuting all these January 6ers to the max, which is what they're doing. It's all in line with this push to absolutely crush dissent in America. And, I'm sure many of you on this follow this a little bit. The World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, who was the leader of that, said that the biggest threat to the World Economic Forum agenda, the so-called global Great Reset, is libertarianism. He literally said that in a speech about a year and a half ago. Libertarianism is the greatest threat to, good policy and the New World Order or whatever going forward. So we are, as libertarians, we are the biggest threat in the idea of the factions of America that fight for the Bill of Rights and individual freedom. We are the biggest threat that the world order sees. And I think these January 6th prosecutions really are part of this, to totally crush dissent.
I'm proud of it.
Yeah.
I'm proud to be that threat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
So I'm willing to wrap it up if you are.
I think so. It sounds like we've beat the horse to death, and but not quite yet. We got a few more horses to kill as proud libertarian. I do indeed thank you, Roger. You have enlightened us all. I think you've answered a lot of our questions about what's going on in the wonderful state of Washington. And yes, we do have a uniparty. We're already there, and it's only going to get worse. Again, thank you, Roger Roots, attorney for some wonderful people back in D.C. that got caught up in a worthwhile cause and should not be getting prosecuted at all. Thanks again, Roger. And good night, all.
Yeah, good night. Thanks, Roger.
Yeah, thank all of you. And thank you, Dave. Thanks so much.